zine or a book or a booklet or book.
A cultural artefact.
Well, it certainly is that. It reminds me, I was watching on YouTube not long ago an old Hancock's half-hour episode called The Missing Page, and it starts off in Hancock's reading this lurid paperback, and Sid James, who he lives with, says, "Oh, you know, what are you reading?" He says, "It's called Lady Don't Fall Backwards." And he says, "It's good?" He says, "Good. As soon as I finish reading it, I'm going to recommend they ban it immediately." Which I thought was kind of, you know, the way those kind of books worked, and certainly some of these were banned. Beautiful Losers by Leonard Cohen was banned in this country. I reckon it should have been banned because it's completely unreadable, but there was obviously some other reason. But this is great. This is a really, really informative book because I didn't realise that Go Ask Alice was a work of fiction. That's how stupid I am. Because when I used to go to Layla High School, I used to be an assistant librarian there in lunch hours, and that and Puberty Blues were sort of the 50 Shades of Grey of the day, you know, in Layla High, and I just assumed it was actually a real diary. And as Ian rightly points out, you know, she goes from never having had an aspirin in her life to shooting speed within 2 weeks. And then there's a really heavy moral message at the end of it. But as Ian also mentioned here, I don't know anyone who ever read that book and didn't end up taking drugs later. I mean, it didn't have the desired effect at all. But it's a great book, as all of Ian's books are, and the one I co-wrote with him, Wild About You, is for sale there, and Tomorrow is Today, and his Seeds of Dissent 3CR calendars were brilliant. His How to Make Trouble and Rebel. I mean, he's got a bibliography as long as Aaron Sandy Lanz's arm. You know, see, a few people got that. A really tall Fremantle footballer, and he's a Fremantle supporter. But we won't hold that against him, and yeah, welcome to the launch, and enjoy yourself, and we're going to have some readings, and here's the man himself, Ian McIntyre.
Thank you. Yeah, so thanks for everyone for coming, and Ian for doing the intros. A bit later we'll have some readings from, I guess, excerpts from some of the books that are reviewed in Sticking It to the Man. I just thought I'd say a few things though about, I guess, how this book came about and what sort of interested in me in this sort of thing. So I guess when I was a teenager in the 80s, a lot of these titles were, well, they weren't particularly vintage at the time, and so they were still pretty widely available, often on library shelves, as Ian was mentioning. And along with things like sort of Chester Himes writing, my local library had a little rack where you could bring along a paperback book and leave one and take one in return. And this rack was where I first sort of read some of the New English Library skinhead and biker novels. It was also the place where I first came across J.G. Ballard's Crash. So when you sort of combine these books with, the library had, I think, a single punk tape, which was Richard Hell and the Voidoids' first album. So kind of combining these rather wild sort of early 70s novels with Richard Hell kind of blew my mind and set me on this, I guess what's been a lifelong interest in subcultures and youth subcultures, but more generally in sort of oddballs and troublemakers of all kinds. So those of you who know me already know I'm a pretty big fan of the 60s and 70s music and sort of counterculture and of radical history in general. But I guess generally those who know me even better would know that I'm not much of a collector. I don't tend to hang on to things. I usually sort of read them and pass them on. But one of the reasons I did hang on to these novels from sort of 1964 through to 1975 was that when I first started reading some of this stuff again in the 90s, I kind of went around looking for guides and writing about them. And in this kind of pre-internet era, unlike, say, with the crime noir stuff, there weren't many books about them. So it sort of got me thinking, oh, it would be great to sort of produce something eventually that kind of brings together, you know, these sort of over-the-top covers with kind of the writing. So I started hanging on to them. So one of the things I have hung on to are these novels, and basically found most of them through op shops and garage sales, school fates, that kind of thing, both here in Australia but also in the UK and Holland. I found quite a lot of stuff there too. And also some friends over the years, like Bruce is here and Simon, as well as a couple of people who aren't here, have also passed on their books. So I've gradually built up a collection of about 200 or 300. And one of the things that I find fascinating about these books is just the sheer volume of novels that came out that were sort of addressing or exploiting the counterculture of the 1960s. If you look at, say, the punk era, there's only probably, I don't know, I've only ever come across a handful of novels. Obviously, punk perhaps didn't have quite the cultural impact that the hippies did, but there's probably 20 times, 30, 40 times as many novels that have hippies in them. And part of the reason for that was that the social upheaval of the 60s was so huge. But the other thing was that this was really the kind of last gasp of the era of the mass paperback. So people still, if they wanted to while away a couple of hours or whatever, they would go, you know, at the train station, pick up a book or whatever. So you had a huge amount of publishing going on. So that meant that you had writers who kind of took the radical politics and the psychedelic drugs or whatever and combined them and were able to be published by mainstream publishers. So people like Richard Brautigan or Harlan Ellison and so forth. So there was a big audience for this stuff and a lot of it came out. Although the beatniks and hobos and other subcultures had sort of generated a certain amount of books, also the counterculture had a real impact in certain areas. Like with science fiction during the late 1960s, early 1970s, science fiction sort of changed from very much being about kind of empires in space, and a lot of it became more about alternate realities and as much about people's empires in their own headspace. On top of that, you also had a whole lot of lowbrow sort of porn, thriller, crime, what have you novels. And a lot of these publishers back then, a lot of these novelists back then, they might be pumping out 2 or 3, some of them dozens of books a year. And, you know, they needed something to write about to flesh out that crime book or that porn novel. So, hey, let's bring in the hippies or let's bring in the student radicals or the Black Panthers or whatever. Now, a lot of those books, you know, they're very trashy and that's what makes them fun now. You know, some of them occasionally are pretty difficult to read, but even where they're really painful, they've still often got really amazing covers. Because a lot of effort back in this era went into having real eye-catching covers so that you could stand out on the newsstand or whatever. So even where the books are kind of, some of them are funny to read now and entertaining to read, some of them are just painful, but even then the covers are usually great. So, yeah, basically, in terms of me actually finally getting the publication together, what happened was in about the early mid-2000s, a friend and I put a website together called Sticking It to the Man. For one reason or another, it never quite got finished. But I ran into an old friend, Simon Strong, who's here, who is from the Later Tape organisation. And he publishes various things. And we got talking about doing a book, and that basically gave me the impetus to drag out all the half-finished reviews and get the scanning finished. And we made the Anarchist Book Fair the deadline, and we just got it done, I think, in about 3 weeks. And Simon's done a fantastic job on the design, and I hope you're all as impressed with it as I am. John Harrison, who's here, has done a book more generally on the sort of pulp era called Hip Pocket Sleaze. And that's sort of given me, in terms of not only sort of getting the reviewing bug a bit again and also looking at John's book, a bit of inspiration maybe to do another title on the same sort of thing in the future. But regardless of whether that happens, I hope you all enjoy the book. I hope it sort of turns you on to some writers you might not have heard of, or at the very least gives you a few laughs. So thanks for coming. I hope you enjoy the book. What we're going to do next is I'm going to get up a few different people to read some excerpts from the original novels. What I've done in the book is, other than the reviews and the covers, I've also occasionally included some excerpts, and that's the kind of thing that you'll be hearing now. So I might get Ian to come up, Ian Marks again first, and he's going to read something from Fear and Loathing in Las Vegas, which I'm sure is a book that's familiar to most of you. It's kind of required reading in the 80s and 90s if you're into drugs or lived in the inner city. And even though the book is supposed to be sort of autobiographical, because it's a gonzo journalist style thing, and because of all the drugs he's taking, it's probably as much fictional as anything. So the section that Ian's going to read from is, for those of you who don't know the book, it's about Hunter S. Thompson and his sidekick Oscar Zeta Acosta, and they travel across the desert to Las Vegas for a kind of police and FBI intelligence conference about drugs. And this part is from where they're basically off their face and sitting in the conference as it goes on.
Thanks, Ian. Actually, also, I'd just like to quote what Ian has written here as well, that Robert Crumb once made the point that during the late 60s, drugs had replaced war as a source of tall stories amongst his peer group, which I think is a really great quote. And also, what's really cool, he's got a Russian, when you open your book to page 27, there's a Russian. So it's, instead of Fear and Loathing in Las Vegas, it's Kutpaks and Otpakway Benak Baras by Zach. Yeah. See, Tom.
Oh no, that was backwards.
A year or so earlier, I had been to the Sky River Rock Festival in rural Washington, where a dozen stone-broke freaks from the Seattle Liberation Front had assembled a sound system that carried every small note of an acoustic guitar. Even a cough or the sound of a boot dropping onto the stage to half-dead acid victims huddled on the bushes half a mile away. But the best technicians available to the National DA's conference in Vegas apparently couldn't handle it. Their sound system looked like something Ulysses S. Grant might have rigged up to address his troops at Vicksburg. The voices from up front crackled with a fuzzy, high-pitched urgency, and the delay was just enough to keep the words disconcertingly out of phase with the speaker's postures. We must come to terms with the drug culture in this country. Those echoes drifted back into the rear in confused waves. The reefer is called a roach because it resembles a cockroach. Cockroach. What the fuck are these people talking about? My attorney whispered. You'd have to be crazy on acid to think a joint looked like a goddamn cockroach. I shrugged. It was clear we had stumbled into a prehistoric gathering. The voice of a drug expert named Bloomquist crackled out to the nearby speakers about these flashbacks. The patient never knows. He thinks it's all over and he gets himself straightened out for the next 6 months, and then, darn it, the whole trip comes right back on him. Gosh darn that fiendish LSD. Dr. E.R. Bloomquist, MD, was the keynote speaker, one of the big stars of the conference. He's the author of a paperback book entitled Marijuana, which, according to the cover, tells it like it is. He is also the inventor of the roach-cockroach theory. Dr. Bloomquist's book is a compendium of state bullshit. On page 49, he describes the 4 states of being in the cannabis society. Cool, groovy, hip, and square. In that descending order. The square is seldom, if ever, cool, states Bloomquist. He is not with it. That he doesn't know what's happening. But if he figures it out, he moves up a notch to hip. And if he can bring himself to approve of what is happening, then he becomes groovy. And after that, with much luck and perseverance, he can rise to the rank of cool.
Okay, so that was from Fear and Loathing in Las Vegas. So the next reading we're going to have is from Adele Danielle, and it's from a book by Barbara Wurzburg called The Dream Watcher. One of the sort of things that took off, I guess, in the late 60s as well was the sort of teen novels. And although it's pretty common now for, I guess, books for teenagers to have things like drugs and sex and suicide and so forth in them, back in the 60s it wasn't. And so there was a whole sort of slew of these kind of very generally quite cringeworthy and earnest novels about young people and their problems. And The Dream Watcher is actually one of the ones that is slightly more sort of tolerable. And yeah, so Adele's going to be reading, it's basically a novel about a sort of young alienated youth, and this is his experience of going to a happening.
Where did that come from? I'm not going to put on an accent, if that's okay. To tell you the truth, I wasn't having a very good time. Everybody was different and all, but I had no idea how to meet them. Then I saw a coffee house that had a sign outside that said, "Happening Tonight." I had read about happenings in Life magazine and was sort of curious to see one. So I went outside with my paper flower and sat down at a table. It was so dark that I couldn't see the menu for about 5 hours, and when I did, it was all written in Italian.
Thanks, Sarah.
I didn't know what to order, but finally something called a cappuccino, which turned out to be coffee and cost $1. Well, the place got very crowded with these hippie people in blankets, and then all the lights suddenly dimmed, and as if they weren't dim enough, and this incredible movie projection flashed on the wall. It was a heart operation, and you can see the heart jumping around with various hands reaching into it, which was really unpleasant. Then this radio static came on very loud, and some insane guy began to run through the audience. Boy, was he a mess. He was half naked and dirty and stank to high heaven. I thought he was going to do something, but all he did was climb up a ladder and close his eyes. Then a girl with silver hair walked out holding an alarm clock. The clock rang its alarm and she jumped on it until it was broken. Next, a little kid came out and poured a bucket of red, white and blue spaghetti on the floor. Meanwhile, this radio static was blaring and the heart operation was still going on. The girl with the silver hair lay down on her back and said the word usury 5 times. Then the little kid covered her with a blanket and the lights came on again and it was over. Boy, was I disappointed. I mean, you could be absolutely certain that something had happened, but I didn't know what it was.
Sounds like a few noise gigs that I've been to that are still got the radio static and the heart operation, so some things never go out of style. Simon Strong's going to be doing From Doctor Who and the Green Death. Now, Doctor Who and the Green Death is definitely worth the read. It's quite a bizarre book. As I sort of mentioned in the review, I don't know whether the sort of lefties at the BBC, of which there were a lot in the early 70s, were just given full sort of rein on this one. But basically, some of you may remember the TV episode because they had this really amazing chroma key green giant maggots and stuff. But it's sort of set in Wales, and there's a Welsh town where economic rationalism sort of wiped out the mines, and a corporate company, chemical company, have moved into the local town. And they're basically pumping all this sludge into the old mines, and everyone starts mutating and so forth. And it's pretty amazing. There's a supercomputer behind the whole corporation that's controlling all the workers and stuff. It's quite bizarre. And in the midst of it all, there is also a Welsh commune, of course. And even the Brigadier, who is very, as people would remember from Doctor Who, very proper and so forth, as the representative of, I can't remember, a NATO step in, even he starts to question the system. So, Simon's going to read a section from basically where the doctor's assistant, Joe, who I think ends up dropping out and joining the commune at the end of the thing before they brought in a new assistant, and she's... Oh, I'm sorry. That's right. Anyway, she's hanging out with one of the leaders of the commune. It's a professor. All right.
Joe couldn't resist butting in. "Do you always use the word man when you mean human being?" The young man laughed. "Oh, very good. After that, you'll never believe that I support women's liberation, will you? Please try and pardon the slip of the tongue." "Oh, thank you," said Joe. "Now, please continue." "Here at Holweald, we're trying to find out how to live in a different way. We want to be human beings again, not slaves of machines of industry and finance." "Do you want a world without machines at all?" asked Joe. "That'd be stupid," said the young man. "What matters is the type of machines we use." "What's your solution?" "Solar energy," he said emphatically. The sun is producing great quantities of energy and we use it. Instead, we burn oil one way or another. We pollute the air we breathe. We could use the movement of the wind and the tides and the rivers. Oh, are you warm enough? Jo was surprised at the question. She loosened her top. Yes, thank you. Heat from the weather. Oh, I do beg your pardon. Heat from the river, he explained. We have a water wheel in the river at the back of the house. It drives an electrical generator and the electricity keeps the house warm. Alternative technology you use. No waste, no pollution. You can ask Aaron about this, actually, he's the expert. Panorama chemicals. Hope to produce 25% more petrol and diesel. This is a particularly fascinating bit, isn't it? Do you realise how they're going to do it? I don't care, said Jo. The process must be based on Bateson's polymerisation. That means thousands of gallons of waste, thick sludge you can't break down, liquid plastic. He paused. I think it's connected with the death of Ted Hughes. Oh, the Green Man, asked Jo. You mean they've been pumping sludge down into the old mine here? He nodded. Could be. That's terrible, said Jo. She looked around the makeshift laboratory. What exactly are you doing in here? Another side of our work, said the young man. Very soon the world is going to need something to replace meat. A high-protein fungus could be the answer. He turned to her. Old Wheel isn't a place for dropouts, you know. I didn't imagine it was, she said quickly. I didn't imagine it was.
Thank you, Simon. So all this and more can be discovered in the pages of Sticking to the Man. So thanks for everyone for coming. Bruce is going to spin some tunes from the era and yeah, enjoy yourself.
But I'm going to do it. Oh, yeah. Convention, I know.